Today we will demonstrate Ayehu's chatbot capabilities, specifically our integration with Slack, with AWS, and how easy it is to automate some service requests, such as provisioning a new instance in AWS or other requests by communicating with the bot. So instead of finding the right application or self-service, going to create a ticket, you could just type that request and get what you want. It could be from simple tasks such as creating tickets in your ITSM platforms, resetting passwords, restarting servers, onboarding employees, and of course, provisioning VMs. So any task that you could automate could potentially be also presented to the endpoint user via the chatbot. So first of all, I would like to show you the Ayehu NG platform. That's what you're seeing currently on your screens, and Ayehu's workflow designer. Now, this designer, if I don't know if you saw it before, will allow you to build those use cases such as this one to provision a new instance in AWS by just dragging and dropping activities or the building blocks that you're seeing right now in the middle of the screen from the left-hand side where you would see our toolbox. Now, building these workflows would allow you to build them without or design them without any scripting or coding. All you have to do is go to the category, for example, like Amazon EC2, which represents our AWS integration, and drag and drop the appropriate activity. Now, all of these are out of the box, and as you can see, this library contains a lot of integrations. And if I'll scroll down a bit, you could also find our Slack integration. So you could communicate with an operator or an endpoint user bidirectionally using the Slack integration itself. And of course, using our AI capabilities, as Guy has mentioned before, you would also be able to integrate with IBM Watson to process any natural language or Microsoft Lewis to do the same, and of course, recognize the intent, the entities, and so on. Now, I would like to transition to the live demo, and then we would go through the workflow itself to see what exactly had happened within it. So I'll move to my Slack chat, and as you can see, we have a chatbot that is named Help Desk. Of course, you could name your chatbot by any name. It could be Operations Chatbot, it could be a Help Desk Chatbot, NOC, SOC, and so on. And whatever workflows you'll publish for the endpoint user, those are the processes that he will be able to automate via this self-service. Okay, so if I'll type hello or hi to the bot, the bot would respond with a few options, and specifically options that our endpoint user has privileges to perform. Some of these processes would be password reset, document access, or network and security issue. And in our case, it would be to provision an AWS instance. Once I'll hit provision AWS instance, the bot would communicate with me as designed in the Ayehu workflow with follow-up steps in order to complete this operation or this process. So then the bot would ask me how many cores of CPU I would like to have in my AWS instance. I would reply with 4. And again, this could be a free text. In our case, within the workflow in Ayehu, we've designed these buttons to give the endpoint user an interactive experience without, of course, too much work from his side. I would select 16 as the number of gigs for our memory, and I would like it to have an operating system which is Microsoft Windows Server 2016. Now, within the Ayehu workflow, we will recognize what is the best type of instance or what is the most appropriate instance given the requirements that the end user provided for our machine, and is T2XL T2X extra large, of course. And to provision this type of instance, we must approve. Once we do, the bot would tell us, thank you, hold on tight while we're provisioning your instance. And again, all of this was designed within the workflow in Ayehu, and I will show you that in a minute. The bot communicated that request to Ayehu, of course, and Ayehu has provisioned a new instance within AWS with the following ID and documented this request in a ticket in ServiceNow, specifically in this case, but it could also be any ITSM platform or any kind of communication method. Once our instance will finish initializing, we will update the ticket with the connection details, and we could also send the connection details back in the Slack channel to the endpoint user. And it's, of course, your choice how to design this specifically. And you could see that our request has ended since the bot replied with goodbye. Now, if I'll move to my AWS, you could see that the same instance is now being initialized within AWS. So our provisioning of AWS instance has completed or is running successfully. And once it will end initializing, of course, we'll get all the connection details. Now, if I'll go back to Ayehu, you could see the flow of this particular process. So if I'll zoom back, you could see that this whole provisioning process took a few steps. I'll show some of these steps just for you to understand how the integration looks like. So, for example, if I'll open the Slack send message activity that gets the number of CPUs, you could see how easy it is to actually configure the Slack message that sends information to the user that initiated the request. And we're using a module that we have configured previously, and I'll show you in a bit how easy it is to actually configure it. You could see the message, which is how many cores of CPU would you like for your instance, and of course the buttons for the values for these cores. And of course, you could provide any type of button names or any type of values here, depending on your scenario. And the response, yes, is selected because we are waiting for a response back from the endpoint user. And you could, of course, configure the timeout or the amount of wait that you would give the endpoint user to answer that question. Now, if the user approves the action, and you could see very similar activity here that asks the user whether or not this request meets his requirements, we will proceed to the left branch to launch an AWS instance. And again, this is rather simple. Of course, you'll provide the module name, our integration with AWS, which again, you don't need to code anything, just to fill out details here within this activity or any other. And of course, you could select the region and provide it as a variable as well. The image name, depending, of course, on the operating system that you've selected, and the instance type. The instance type, of course, would be one of the instance types that are available within AWS. So you could see that here we're also opening a ticket in ServiceNow within the same integration that we have in our platform. And all in all, this workflow is rather short, simple, but very powerful, and empowers the endpoint user with the possibility of provisioning a new instance. Now, of course, you could add more steps to this workflow, such as configuring the VM or the instance itself, such as asking for approvals from the manager of that particular endpoint user to actually provision that VM or instance, and so on. So the scenario itself is, of course, dependent on you. And moreover, in some cases, we will also use the artificial intelligence piece for NLU in order to understand the intent of the endpoint user. In our case, of course, we wanted to guide the user ourselves with the options that he could perform when he chose to provision an AWS instance. But just with typing provisioning, he could also reach this particular request, and the appropriate workflow within our platform will be triggered. Now, if we'll go to the audit trail and see the execution of that workflow, we could do so very easily. So you could see that the event start type or when the event came in, okay? And you could see everything that transpired below in the activity log when the workflow started executing. You could see all the inputs by the endpoint user, such as CPU, memory, if he approved or not. You could see that we have checked what would be the best instance type for his input for CPU and memory. And in the end of the day, the AWS launch, if it was successful or not, the ticket that was created, and any other steps that we have chosen to take. Of course, we have the appropriate trigger configured, since every workflow requires the appropriate trigger to trigger that specific workflow. So in our case, in the case that we receive an endpoint user's message via Slack, we'll trigger the main workflow for Slack that interprets the intent of the user, in our case, provisioning, and triggers the appropriate workflow, in this case, Slack and Watson. And the last piece that I would like to tell you, to share with you, of course, is the integrations themselves and how easy it is to integrate with these tools within Ayehu NG. So first of all, the AWS piece, if I'll expand the connection parameters, you see how easy it is to integrate with AWS by just providing the access keys and secret keys to your particular AWS environment. And from that point on, you could perform any changes via our out-of-the-box content within the workflow designer to provision new instances, to manage them, and to perform any maintenance actions that you might need in order to perform your processes. And same goes to our Slack integration, which is also very straightforward. After creating the bot on the Slack cloud, you would need to provide, of course, the token for that bot, the users that are authorized to access the bot. You could restrict them, of course, within Slack as well, and any words that would trigger an event within Ayehu. Once one of these words would be mentioned to the chatbot, our platform will pick up that message as an event, and if it has the trigger to trigger a workflow, the workflow will be triggered and the event will start that workflow in order to complete that specific process. So to recap, you could create a chatbot in Slack that communicates with Ayehu. Ayehu is able to communicate back and forth with that particular endpoint user who initiated the request, and is able to complete any task that was previously pre-configured in Ayehu in the shape of a workflow. Again, this could be a provisioning task, it could be an onboarding task, it could be a task that performs some sort of an incident response or any self-service request.